This PowerPoint is addressing moral isolationism. Moral isolationism is a phenomenon that began to be noticed in the 1980s. As usual, we start with the imagery of the archer and of the target. And I'd remind you that the target in terms of ethics is the bullseye of doing that which is good and right and what we ought to do. And we've spoken about the background of why those terms are used to describe the bullseye in ethics in other lectures. Okay, so in 1987, a book was released by a pretty well-known American educator. He's a philosopher and classicist, Alan Bloom. And he taught in a number of pretty famous places, Yale University, and he taught in University of Chicago, but he also taught in Canada and in Israel and in France. He got around, and he was a brilliant man. And he began to recognize something in the 1980s. He was the first one to really, on a large level, or at a national level, point this out to American educators. His book was called The Closing of the American Mind, and here's what he said. There is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes or says he believes that truth is relative. If this belief is put to the test, one can count on the student's reaction. They'll be uncomprehending, like amazed that the professor would dare to disagree with this. That anyone should regard the proposition that truth is relative as not being self-evident astonishes them, as though you were calling into question 2 + 2 = 4. These are things you don't think about. That it is a moral issue for students is revealed by the character of their response when challenged, a combination of disbelief and indignation. And I have to say, it's only gotten worse across the years. That was 33 years ago that book was released, and the situation is perhaps even more so. Well, not perhaps, it's more so, that people are astonished that you would say that truth is not entirely relative to the individual and to the culture. So you had in your readings Ruth Benedict, who is a cultural anthropologist, and then as kind of a over against what Benedict wrote, Mary Midgley and her concept of moral isolationism. I discovered Mary Midgley at the Bodleian Library quite a few years ago and found her to be charming and funny. She compared philosophy to plumbing, which would take a little bit too long to unpack. But I thought it was just a very funny and, in today's terminology, a snarky way of saying we need philosophy. So this is her article, comes from her book, Heart and Mind, or her chapter, I guess, Trying Out One's New Sword. I'm going to largely speak right through this, read it to you, and then comment. And so I'm not going to read the whole article. Don't worry if you're somebody who's not a part of this class. Just going to excerpt from it. All of us are, she says, more or less in trouble today about trying to understand culture strange to us. We hear constantly of alien customs. And she's absolutely right. And the reason for this is because of the phenomenon of globalization. Now, more than ever before in human history, people from all over the world and from very different cultures are right nearby to one another. They're neighbors and they're classmates and they're workmates. We see changes in our lifetime which would have astonished our parents, indeed. I want to discuss here one very short way of dealing with this, a drastic way which many people now theoretically favor. It consists in simply denying that we can ever understand any culture except our own well enough to make judgments about it. And actually, along with that goes the kind of the prohibition against making such judgments. Those who recommend this hold that the world is sharply divided into separate societies, sealed units, each with its own system of thought. They feel that the respect and tolerance due from one system to another forbids us to ever take up a critical position to any other culture. Moral judgment, they suggest, is a kind of coinage valid only in its country of origin. And I think I have spoken to you, I know I've spoken to you in other of these PowerPoints and also in articles I've given you to read for class about Steven Pinker, the cognitive psychologist from MIT, and of Donald Simons, the anthropologist, American anthropologist from University of California, Kai Nielsen from University of Calgary, the atheist philosopher, and Simon Blackburn, the English philosopher who's taught both at Oxford and at Cambridge. All of these men are atheists, and all of these men have expressed incredulity at this phenomenon and are just mystified that anybody could doubt that the Nazi final solution, that the practice of clitoridectomy, we go on with that, wife beating, beheading, all these things are morally wrong. How is it that students could possibly come to the conclusion that because it's another culture, that thereby we can't comment on it? So this is not just something that Mary Midgley and these other Alan Bloom, these other academics, all are just mystified that this is the response that's going on. But it's a cultural kind of a thing. It's not really a taught kind of a thing as far as academics go. She says, I shall call this position moral isolationism. Now, isolationism is a political position. And if you're an American and you're unaware, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in a situation where America took an isolationist position with regard to the Second World War. And he had to, through the Canadians, smuggle, as it were, or go through channels that were not permitted in order to help out the war effort in England until finally America came into the war. There were some pretty strong factors with some pretty famous names, actually Joseph Kennedy being one of the leading names, that were against the idea of us getting involved in the Second World War. And so moral isolationism, she's using that term in order to compare it to political isolationism, where a country just maroons itself and says, we're not going to get involved with the world scene. Pretty much, I would say that Switzerland is the most famous country in our time as far as their practice of isolationism and always wanting to remain neutral. So she goes on, she says, after coining that term, I shall suggest that it is certainly not forced upon us, meaning logically forced upon us, and indeed it makes no sense at all. People usually take it up because they think it's a respectful attitude to other cultures. In fact, however, it's not respectful. Nobody can respect what is entirely unintelligible to them. Exactly. If we can't understand anything about other cultures, how is it respectful for us not to critique them? If we don't understand anything about them, then we don't respect them. They're an unknown. They're factor X. To respect someone, we have to know enough about him to make a favorable judgment, however general and tentative it might be. And we do understand people in other cultures to this extent. Otherwise, a great mass of our most valuable thinking would be paralyzed. I mean, it's just silly for us to say otherwise. To show this, I shall take a remote, by that she means one that you're probably not familiar with, example, because we shall probably find it easier to think calmly about it than we should with a contemporary one, such as female circumcision in Africa, which has been addressed in this class, or the Chinese Cultural Revolution. That's a big topic, but there was an awful lot of atrocities committed during the Cultural Revolution. But those are two that definitely would get an awful lot of feedback and pushback and people objecting. The principles involved will still be the same. My example is this. There is, it seems, a verb in classical Japanese which means to try out one's new sword on a chance wayfarer. The word is tsujigiri, literally crossroads cut. A samurai sword had to be tried out because if it was to work properly, it had to slice through someone at a single blow from the shoulder to the opposite flank. That's a diagonal blow, typically from right to left, down from the shoulder down towards the hip. Otherwise, the warrior bungled his stroke. This could injure his honor, offend his ancestors, and even let down his emperor. So tests were needed, and wayfarers had to be expended. Literally, just let's go out and chop some stranger in two, from shoulder to hip. Any wayfarer would do, provided, of course, that he was not another samurai. Recognize a familiar problem about the rights of experimental subjects. That's just a passing remark, but... Now, when we hear of a custom like this, we may well reflect that we simply do not understand it and therefore are not qualified to criticize it at all because we are not members of that culture. Let's hit the pause button there for a second. What about the people married to the wayfarer, or who had the wayfarer as being their father or their mother, who gets sliced in two diagonally by some samurai who's out to try out his sword? What about them? It doesn't matter which culture you're in. You can see the inhumanity of this, the cruelty of this, and the injustice of this. Period. But we're not members of any other culture either except our own, so we extend the principle to cover all extraneous cultures, and we seem therefore to be moral isolationists. But this is, as we shall see, an impossible position. Let us ask what it would involve. We must first ask, Does the isolating barrier work both ways? Are people in other cultures equally unable to criticize us? This question struck me sharply when I read a remark in The Guardian, perhaps I think it is the #1 newspaper in England these days, by an anthropologist about a South American Indian who had been taken into a Brazilian town for an operation which saved his life. When he came back to his village, he made several highly critical remarks about the white Brazilians' way of life. They may very well have been justified, but the interesting point was that the anthropologist called these remarks a damning indictment of Western civilization. That's a little dissociative, that we can't comment on other cultures, but they can comment on our cultures, and when they do, it's a damning indictment. Now, the Indian had been in that town about 2 weeks. Was he in a position to deliver a damning indictment? Would we ourselves be qualified to deliver such an indictment on the samurai, provided we could spend 2 weeks in ancient Japan? What do we really think about this? Do we really think that I can't say anything about this culture as far as what's good or bad about it? My own impression, she says, is that we believe that outsiders can, in principle, deliver perfectly good indictments. Only it usually takes more than 2 weeks to make them damning. I mean, it'd be damning if you really get the culture. Understanding has degrees. It is not a slapdash, yes or no matter. Intelligent outsiders can progress in it, and in some ways will be at an advantage over the locals. But if this is so, it must clearly apply to ourselves as much as to anybody else. So, I mean, it's contradiction. It's a logical contradiction to say we can't comment on other people's cultures, but then say they can comment on ours. I think this works the same way in the United States as it does in England. We seem to think this. Our next question is this: does the isolating barrier between cultures block praise as well as blame? If I want to say that the samurai culture has many virtues, or to praise the South American Indians, am I prevented from doing that by my outside status? Now, we certainly do need to praise other societies in this way, but it is hardly possible that we could praise them effectively if we could not, in principle, criticize them. And that's just logical, folks. How is it that I can praise you, but I can't criticize you? How is it I can say good things about a culture, but I can't say anything bad about the culture? That is not logically consistent. Our praise would be worthless if it rested on no definite grounds, if it did not flow from some understanding. Certainly we may need to praise things which we do not fully understand. And you've had this experience of not fully knowing, most of us have, of not fully knowing a situation, but we can have a read on the situation that it's something good is here. We say there's something very good here, but I can't quite make out what it is yet. This happens when we want to learn from strangers, and we can learn from strangers. But to do this, we have to distinguish between those strangers who are worth learning from and those who are not. Can we then judge which is which? This brings us to our third question. What is involved in judging? Now, plainly, there's no question here of sitting on a bench in a red robe and sentencing people. Judging simply means forming an opinion and expressing it if it is called for. Is there anything wrong about this? Naturally, we ought to avoid forming and expressing crude opinions like that of a simple-minded missionary who might dismiss the whole samurai culture as entirely bad because it's non-Christian. But this is a different objection. The trouble with crude opinions is that they are crude, whoever forms them, not that they're formed by the wrong people. Anthropologists, after all, are outsiders quite as much as missionaries. Moral isolationism forbids us to form any opinion on these matters, which means it's impossible. You couldn't do the discipline of cultural anthropology if you can't form any opinions. Now, cultural anthropologists learn to be slow to form their opinions and to take time to try to see the actions that are going on around them in their context, but they believe they can begin to fathom and understand that culture better. Going on, she says, its ground for doing so is that we don't understand them, but there's much that we don't understand in our own culture too. Must I completely understand a culture before I can critique it? This brings us to our last question. If we can't judge other cultures, can we really judge our own? Our efforts to do so will be much damaged if we are really deprived of our opinions about other societies, because these provide the range of comparison. When we're looking at America, we got to compare it to other societies, whether it's one that's put forward hypothetically, like in Plato's Republic, or it's one that actually exists in the real world, we've got to be able to compare our society to other societies. The spectrum of alternatives against which we set what we want to understand. We would have to stop using the mirror which anthropology so helpfully holds up to us if we're really going to adopt moral isolationism. In short, moral isolationism would lay down a general ban on moral reasoning. Essentially, this is the program of immoralism, which is Nietzsche and also J.L. Mackie. And it carries a distressing logical difficulty. Immoralists, like Nietzsche, are actually just a rather specialized sect of moralists. Remember, Nietzsche did not want to be a nihilist. He wants there be a morality, but he wants to have a different morality. They can no more afford to put moralizing out of business than smugglers can afford to abolish customs regulations. Hit the pause button. What does that mean? Well, a smuggler is selling black market goods that they got into the country by bypassing customs. Smugglers wouldn't have anything that anyone wanted if there weren't the custom regulations. Custom regulations sets the standard that makes the black market goods that the smuggler has desirable and priced in such a way that people can afford them. And she's making an analogy here. She's saying that's what this is like. You can't do away with moral standards and have immoralism work. The power of moral judgment is, in fact, not a luxury, not a perverse indulgence of the self-righteous. It's a necessity. When we judge something to be good, bad or good, better or worse than something else, we are taking it as an example to aim at or avoid. Again, hit the pause button. What does that sound like? When we judge something to be bad or good, better or worse than something else, we are taking it as an example to aim at or avoid. The motif of the class, archery, bullseye. So here's another philosopher saying what Aristotle and what Bentham and what Kant all say elsewhere. Without opinions of this sort, we would have no framework of comparison for our own policy, no chance of profiting by other people's insights or mistakes. In this vacuum, we could form no judgments on our own actions. And so the effect of moral isolationism is to leave us marooned on a desert island. This is now me and not her. Her article's done, but I'm commenting on her. Moral isolationism, in effect, maroons us on the desert island of our own culture and says that only here and nowhere else can we engage in cultural critique. And that's just not warranted by the facts. First of all, we're not as completely cut off from other people, so there's no touch points between us and their culture. There may be that we've got to come to understand some of their language and some of their customs and some of their thought processes and their worldview, but we can have communication. We don't think that we live completely isolated from them. So this is simply not warranted by the facts. It is humanly unworkable. You are a creature who renders ethical judgments all the time. You are an ethicist already when you came to this course. All human beings are. We're moral creatures. It would require one to either override or turn a deaf ear to or euthanize her conscience to do otherwise. Yet as we've seen, Hume says that we need our emotions and our passions in order to do morality. How do I keep my ethical edge sharp if I must turn off my conscience when engaging cultures other than my own? So the point here is, for the takeaway is, moral isolationism simply doesn't work, even if it's culturally popular.